I. Opening the paradox. On a ridge above Asheville, North Carolina, there is a house that does not behave like a house. It does not sit in the landscape as shelter. It does not announce itself as an experiment. It does not negotiate with its surroundings. It rises as if it has always been there. Stone walls anchor it to the ground with a confidence that suggests time has already been accounted for. Towers interrupt the sky not as gestures but as assumptions. A roofline borrowed from a European vocabulary, one formed in societies where power learned centuries ago how to remain still, settles into the horizon without apology. The structure does not ask to be understood. It presents itself as a fact. Biltmore Estate is still standing. It remains the largest private home ever built in the United States. No later ambition has surpassed its scale. No subsequent era has attempted to repeat it in private form. The building has not been made smaller by time. If anything, time has cleared space around it, allowing its size to register more cleanly. Visitors move through it slowly, not because signs instruct them to, not because guides insist. They slow because the building controls pace. Corridors lengthen steps. Ceilings pull attention upward. Distances stretch ordinary movement into process. The body adjusts before the mind intervenes. This is not intimidation, it is calibration. The architecture teaches its own rhythm. The house was built to suggest permanence. What it does not explain, what it was never meant to explain, is how much effort is required to maintain that suggestion. Biltmore was designed to look older than the system that produced it. Its stone implies lineage. Its proportions imply inheritance. Its mass implies that what exists here has always existed here, and that it will continue to exist regardless of what happens beyond its grounds. None of this is true. The estate exists because of a brief alignment in American history, a moment when industrial wealth accumulated faster than regulation could restrain it, when labor was abundant and largely invisible, when land could be consolidated without resistance, and when scale itself was mistaken for stability. Those conditions no longer exist. The house does. This is the first paradox. Biltmore was conceived as a private residence, yet it survives only because it no longer functions as one. Its continued existence depends on systems that were never part of its original promise: visitors ticketing, institutional management, conservation strategies, and a constant flow of resources redirected toward preservation. The appearance of endurance is sustained through continuous intervention. The second paradox is quieter, but more revealing. The house was imagined as a retreat from modernity. It was meant to feel insulated from industrial life, from the noise and volatility of the age that produced it. And yet, from the beginning, it was equipped with the most advanced technologies available at the time. Electricity ran behind stone walls. Elevators moved silently through medieval forms. Climate systems regulated air in rooms designed to appear centuries old. Internal communication networks coordinated labor out of sight. Modern infrastructure concealed to protect an ancient illusion. What appears timeless is supported by what was once experimental. Biltmore does not reject progress. It hides it. Progress exists only to serve the impression of permanence, never to challenge it. The building performs age while relying on innovation. It presents stability while depending on systems that require constant adjustment. This contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. Biltmore was never designed to be efficient. Efficiency belongs to factories, not estates. It was designed to be convincing. Convincing that American wealth, new industrial and volatile, could harden into something immovable. Convincing that size could substitute for history. Convincing that a single family could sustain a structure built at institutional scale without becoming an institution itself. That final assumption did not hold. The building remains because it failed early enough to adapt. Biltmore did not disappear when its private logic weakened. It did not burn, collapse, or fall into neglect. Instead, it changed categories. It shifted from residence to managed environment, from private assertion to public artifact. The structure survived by surrendering the life it was built to contain. This adaptation is often described as preservation. It is more accurate to call it negotiation. The house no longer claims permanence as a natural condition. It accepts permanence as a managed outcome. Schedules replace seasons. Budgets replace inheritance. Conservation replaces assumption. What once relied on the authority of ownership now relies on the discipline of administration. The illusion remains convincing precisely because the work behind it has been professionalized. From a distance, Biltmore still appears settled. From within, it still overwhelms, but its relationship to time has changed. It no longer stands outside of historical process. It is fully inside it, documented, interpreted, maintained, justified. This shift does not diminish the building. It clarifies it. Biltmore now reveals something its builders could not have intended to show, that permanence is not achieved through size, stone, or style. It is achieved through systems willing to absorb cost indefinitely. When those systems change, permanence must renegotiate its terms. The house stands today as a physical object and a conceptual problem. Why did this exist? Why does it still exist? And what does its survival actually prove? The largest private home in America remains intact, not because it defeated time, but because it learned how to live inside it. The building remains. The world that made such a house rational does not. Origin context. Why this could exist. Biltmore Estate did not emerge from individual ambition alone. It emerged from alignment. Not alignment of taste or personality or even vision, but alignment of systems. Economic systems, legal systems, geographic conditions, cultural assumptions. For a brief period in American history, these systems overlapped in a way that made something like Biltmore not only possible but logical. That window was narrow. It did not stay open for long, but it stayed open long enough. 1. Industrial wealth without cultural absorption. By the late 19th century, the United States was producing wealth faster than it had ever produced meaning. Industrialization did not simply increase output. It compressed time. Railroads collapsed distance. Telegraphs collapsed delay. Markets expanded beyond regional logic into national systems. Capital moved quickly, accumulated rapidly, and concentrated unevenly. This speed mattered. In older societies, wealth often accumulated slowly enough to be absorbed into culture. Titles, land, and ritual developed alongside money. Hierarchies stabilized because they were reinforced over generations. In the United States, that process was interrupted. Fortunes appeared suddenly without the social infrastructure required to interpret them. Money arrived without ceremony. Factories and railroads proved efficiency, not legitimacy. They generated profit, not reverence. They were noisy, visible, and politically vulnerable. Industrial wealth was powerful, but it was also exposed. This created a problem for the new elite. How does wealth become authority when it has no past? Architecture offered an answer. Stone, scale, and land carried meanings that money alone did not. They implied duration. They suggested continuity. They created the appearance of inevitability. A large house did not need to explain its owner's balance sheet. It only needed to exist. Biltmore belongs to this moment when architecture became a tool for translating economic power into cultural stability. 2. American law and the permission to build large. Biltmore could not have existed in most European contexts of the same period. Land ownership in the United States was unusually permissive. Vast tracts could be acquired by private individuals with minimal restriction. Inheritance laws did not prevent consolidation. Zoning regulations were embryonic. Environmental constraints were largely unenforced. The legal framework treated land as commodity rather than legacy. This mattered profoundly. Where European aristocracies were constrained by centuries of negotiated limits on land use, inheritance, and public obligation, American elites operated in a landscape of opportunity rather than restraint. The state did not yet see large private estates as competing with public infrastructure. The boundary between personal wealth and institutional scale remained porous. Biltmore exploited that porosity. Thousands of acres could be assembled, reshaped, and managed as a single vision. Forests could be cleared, replanted, and disciplined. Roads could be carved for procession rather than access. The estate was not merely placed on land. It reorganized land. This reorganization was legal. It was accepted. It was celebrated. For a brief period, scale itself was interpreted as national confidence rather than private excess. 3. Geography as insulation, not isolation. Western North Carolina offered something rare: distance without disconnection. The Blue Ridge Mountains created natural separation from industrial centers, but rail access preserved mobility. Elevation moderated climate. Forests absorbed sound. Terrain controlled approach. The region allowed withdrawal without disappearance. This balance was critical. Industrial wealth did not want isolation. Isolation implies retreat. It wanted insulation, protection from scrutiny, unrest, and volatility, while retaining command over capital-producing systems elsewhere. Biltmore's location achieved that insulation. The estate was far enough from cities to avoid daily exposure, but close enough to remain operationally connected. Trains delivered guests, materials, and labor. Communication systems maintained control. The house existed outside the noise of industry without surrendering its benefits. Distance became a resource. The journey itself mattered. Arrival was not immediate. Roads curved. Views were delayed. Time was stretched intentionally. By the time the house came into view, visitors had already entered its logic. The landscape prepared perception before architecture completed it. This was not accidental geography. It was strategic geography. 4. Land as system, not scenery. At Biltmore, land was not decorative. It was infrastructural. Forests were managed as resources, not preserved, not exploited recklessly, but disciplined. Agricultural experiments took place on the estate. Roads were engineered for flow and control. Vistas were framed to appear natural while concealing the degree of intervention involved. The estate functioned as a controlled environment. This control served two purposes. First, it reinforced authority. A house surrounded by managed land appears rooted. Power that extends beyond walls into terrain suggests permanence. The scale of the estate implied stability beyond individual lifetimes. Second, it absorbed labor. Large estates functioned as economic systems. Construction, maintenance, forestry, agriculture, and service created continuous demand for workers. Local economies adjusted around that demand. Labor pools formed. Infrastructure followed private need. Biltmore generated gravity. The surrounding region did not simply host the estate, it reorganized itself in response to it. This reorganization further normalized the presence of concentrated private power. The estate became a fact of regional life rather than an anomaly. 5. Culture and the normalization of excess. The Gilded Age did not merely tolerate excess, it celebrated it. Large projects were framed as evidence of national maturity. Industrial expansion was associated with progress. Private ambition was conflated with public confidence. Building big was interpreted as building forward. In this cultural climate, restraint could look like hesitation. Newspapers documented large houses as social facts. Society pages reported on estates as stages. Architecture became a visible ranking system. Size communicated position. Location communicated taste. Materials communicated seriousness. Biltmore was not an outlier in this system. It was an apex. Its scale did not provoke immediate backlash, because the culture lacked a vocabulary to critique it effectively. Inequality was visible but not yet politicized in architectural terms. The estate appeared as a triumph of organization rather than a concentration of resources. This cultural permissiveness was temporary. Even as Biltmore was nearing completion, attitudes were shifting. Reform movements gained traction. Labor organization intensified. Public scrutiny of wealth increased. The assumption that private scale equaled public legitimacy began to erode. But again, timing mattered. Biltmore was completed just before these shifts became dominant. It crossed the threshold while the door was still open. 6. Inefficiency as signal. One of the most misunderstood aspects of estates like Biltmore is inefficiency. From a modern perspective, a house used only part of the year appears wasteful. A landscape maintained without direct economic return appears irrational. A workforce sustained beyond immediate necessity appears excessive. In the Gilded Age, these qualities functioned as signals. Inefficiency demonstrated surplus. Surplus demonstrated control. A building that did not need to justify its own cost communicated that its owner operated beyond necessity. An estate maintained regardless of use suggested that resources were not constrained by function. This was not a failure of logic. It was its expression. Biltmore was designed to be inefficient. Its size exceeded daily need. Its land exceeded functional requirement. Its systems exceeded minimal operation. All of this communicated stability in a society that equated scarcity with vulnerability. The estate's inefficiency was a message. 7. The temporary nature of the alignment. Every condition that made Biltmore possible was temporary. Industrial wealth became more regulated. Labor became more organized. Public attitudes toward excess hardened. Legal frameworks evolved. The alignment dissolved. What remained was stone. Biltmore exists because the systems that enabled it overlapped briefly. It survives because it learned to operate after that overlap ended. The house stands at the boundary between two eras, one that allowed private individuals to build at institutional scale, and one that required institutions to sustain what had already been built. This boundary defines the estate's meaning. Biltmore is not evidence of permanence achieved, it is evidence of permanence negotiated. The estate remains. The conditions that made it rational do not. The human force who wanted this. George Washington Vanderbilt II did not build Biltmore to compete publicly with other industrial dynasties. He built it to resolve a private tension created by the world that produced him. He inherited magnitude without inheriting orientation. By the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt fortune had already achieved what most fortunes never would: saturation. Rail networks spanned regions. Capital moved through markets with minimal friction. The family name carried immediate recognition. Yet recognition is not the same as legitimacy. Visibility is not the same as permanence. George Vanderbilt's position within this landscape was unusual. He was not an operator in the way earlier Vanderbilts had been. He did not extend rail lines or consolidate markets. He did not appear at the center of industrial conflict. Instead, he observed the system from within it, insulated by inheritance and unconvinced by its cultural rewards. This distinction matters. Operators build outward. Curators build inward. Vanderbilt's interests were not aligned with the public performance of power. He collected books rather than companies. He traveled rather than expanded. He cultivated taste rather than influence. His education and temperament oriented him toward synthesis of ideas, of art, of environment rather than conquest. Yet synthesis requires a container. The American industrial environment offered no stable container for the kind of life Vanderbilt imagined. Cities were productive but unstable. They were loud with labor politics and reform movements. They displayed wealth, but they also interrogated it. Urban life exposed industrial fortunes to scrutiny precisely because it depended on them. Vanderbilt wanted distance from that exposure without losing status. Biltmore was the mechanism that made this possible. The decision to build was not impulsive. It followed years of travel and observation. Vanderbilt had spent time in Europe absorbing models of land ownership and cultural authority that were fundamentally different from American norms. There, wealth was slow. It was embedded in place. It did not need to announce itself daily because it had already been announced centuries earlier. America had no equivalent. Biltmore was an attempt to construct one. This attempt was not nostalgic. It was strategic. Vanderbilt did not want to recreate Europe. He wanted to neutralize the comparison. By building a structure that spoke the language of aristocracy fluently, he aimed to remove the question of whether American wealth could ever look settled. The answer, he believed, could be built. This belief shaped every major decision. Richard Morris Hunt was selected not because he would innovate, but because he would translate. Hunt's training at the École des Beaux-Arts provided access to a vocabulary already saturated with authority. The châteauesque style was not chosen for comfort or whim. It was chosen because it carried assumptions that did not need to be explained. Frederick Law Olmsted's involvement followed the same logic. Olmsted did not treat landscape as decoration. He treated it as discipline. Roads, forests, and vistas were designed to regulate perception and movement. The land would not simply surround the house. It would prepare the mind for it. Together, these collaborators produced not a residence, but a worldview rendered in stone and terrain. Vanderbilt's ambition was coherence. He wanted a place where wealth did not have to justify itself continuously, where taste could substitute for lineage, where scale could replace narrative. Biltmore offered this by operating at a register beyond daily life. It removed the owner from the rhythms of industrial production and placed him inside a controlled environment where time moved differently. This desire reveals a deeper insecurity. Industrial fortunes depend on forces beyond personal control. Markets fluctuate, labor organizes, regulation evolves. Even immense wealth can feel provisional when its sources are volatile. Vanderbilt understood this intuitively. His response was not to seek more control over markets, but to seek distance from them. Distance felt safer than dominance. Biltmore provided that distance by transforming wealth into environment. Money ceased to be an abstract figure and became physical mass. Capital became stone. Volatility was countered with weight. This transformation did not eliminate risk. It reclassified it. The house was designed to minimize uncertainty through scale and systemization. Life inside followed predictable patterns. Staff operated within rigid structures. Seasons regulated use. Nothing was left to improvisation. The estate functioned as a private institution long before it was publicly acknowledged as one. This institutional character was not accidental. It was required. A project of this size cannot tolerate informality. It demands coordination. It demands hierarchy. It demands continuity. Vanderbilt did not merely accept these demands. He embraced them. They aligned with his desire for order in a world he perceived as increasingly unstable. Yet this embrace created its own tension. The house was meant to stabilize identity, but it also fixed it. Vanderbilt became inseparable from the structure he commissioned. His personal life was absorbed into the logic of the estate. Private preference gave way to institutional necessity. The house required presence, oversight, and resources regardless of individual inclination. In building a refuge, Vanderbilt constructed an obligation. This obligation did not immediately appear burdensome. In the early years, the estate functioned as intended. It offered insulation from public scrutiny. It provided a controlled environment for intellectual and cultural pursuits. It allowed wealth to feel settled. But the conditions that sustained this equilibrium were external. As public attitudes toward concentrated wealth hardened and the social climate shifted, the estate's insulation became less effective. Distance no longer guaranteed legitimacy. Scale no longer silenced critique. What had once looked inevitable began to look deliberate. Vanderbilt did not respond by escalating. He did not expand the estate further or intensify its symbolism. Instead, the logic of the project revealed its limit. A structure built to remove doubt cannot adapt easily when doubt returns. This is the constraint of architectural solutions to social problems. Architecture can stabilize perception. It cannot stabilize history. Vanderbilt's foresight was precise and bounded. He understood how to assemble authority within the conditions of his time. He did not anticipate how quickly those conditions would change. He built for a present he wanted to slow, not for a future that would demand explanation. The estate carries this limitation forward. It stands as the result of a human decision that was neither naive nor reckless, but contextually rational. Vanderbilt did not misunderstand his world. He understood it deeply enough to recognize its instability and responded by building something that appeared to stand outside it. What he could not do was build something that would remain unquestioned. Biltmore is not the monument of a single will imposing itself on history. It is the artifact of a mind attempting to resolve systemic uncertainty through form. Its scale reflects not arrogance, but anxiety transformed into stone. The human force behind Biltmore was not conquest. It was consolidation. A desire to gather wealth, taste, land, and time into a single frame that could hold still while everything else moved. The estate achieved this briefly, long enough to exist, not long enough to remain unquestioned. Vanderbilt did not fail. He reached the limit of what architecture could do for a private individual operating at the edge of institutional scale. The house remains. The problem it was meant to solve has changed shape. IV architecture as power. Biltmore Estate does not express power through declaration. It expresses power through arrangement. Nothing about the estate confronts directly. There is no single moment where authority is announced in words or symbols. Instead, power accumulates. It builds gradually through distance, proportion, sequence, and repetition until it becomes ambient felt rather than recognized. This is not accidental. It is architectural strategy. 1. Approach as conditioning. Power at Biltmore begins before the house is visible. The approach is extended intentionally. Roads curve instead of cutting straight lines, views are delayed, then partially revealed, then withdrawn again. Arrival is transformed from movement into process. By the time the building appears in full, the visitor has already adjusted pace, expectation, and posture. This matters. Architecture that seeks authority does not rush perception. It prepares it. The estate teaches patience before it teaches scale. Distance becomes instruction. Time becomes a tool. This conditioning has a psychological effect. What takes effort to reach is assumed to be valuable. What reveals itself slowly is assumed to be important. The house does not need signage or narrative to establish dominance. The journey performs that work silently. By the time one reaches the facade, resistance has already softened. Do scale as discipline. The chateau-esque form is not chosen for beauty alone. It is chosen for its historical associations with settled hierarchy. In European contexts, such forms emerged where power no longer needed to prove itself daily. Towers' symmetry and mass communicated surveillance order and continuity without confrontation. At Biltmore, these elements are transplanted into a different context, but their function remains intact. Scale is the primary instrument. The building exceeds domestic necessity at every level. Rooms are larger than required for comfort. Ceilings rise beyond acoustic efficiency. Circulation spaces widen beyond function. The human body becomes proportionally small, not as punishment but as calibration. This calibration is critical. When bodies feel small, authority feels large. When movement requires effort, presence feels conditional. The architecture does not humiliate, it normalizes imbalance. Visitors do not feel attacked. They feel oriented. This orientation produces compliance without command. 3. Sequence over statement. Biltmore's interior does not rely on a single grand gesture. It relies on sequence. Rooms unfold gradually. Public spaces lead to semi-public spaces which lead to controlled intimacies. Each transition reinforces hierarchy. One does not simply arrive in a room. One passes through thresholds that recalibrate expectation. This sequencing matters more than decoration. Authority is not asserted by ornament alone. It is asserted by control over progression. The house determines where one may go, how one may arrive, and how long one may remain. Movement becomes participation in a system rather than free choice. This is architecture functioning as governance. 4. Hierarchy embedded in space. Hierarchy at Biltmore is not symbolic. It is spatial. Public rooms occupy the most prominent volumes. They receive the most light. They command the most attention. Private rooms retreat behind layers. Service spaces disappear into parallel systems of corridors, staircases, and routes designed explicitly to avoid intersection. This separation is not decorative, it is operational. Those who maintain the estate move constantly but invisibly. Labor circulates without disrupting the impression of effortlessness. Service is felt as continuity, not presence. The house anticipates labor and designs its absence. This invisibility protects authority. Power that must acknowledge labor risks negotiation. Power that appears self-sustaining does not. 5. Technology as subordinate. One of the most revealing aspects of Biltmore's architecture is what it hides. From its inception, the house incorporated advanced technologies, electrical systems, elevators, climate regulation, internal communication networks. These systems were essential to making the estate functional. They were also potential threats to the illusion of antiquity. The solution was concealment. Technology is absorbed into walls, floors, and ceilings. Mechanical rooms are isolated. Infrastructure exists only to support experience, never to interrupt it. Progress is permitted only insofar as it reinforces tradition. This inversion matters. In industrial architecture, form serves function. At Biltmore, function serves form. The house presents itself as timeless, precisely because time has been disciplined and hidden. Innovation is not rejected, it is subordinated. 6. Architecture as educator. Biltmore does not require instruction manuals. Behavior is taught implicitly. Visitors lower their voices without being asked. They slow their steps without being guided. They pause where proportion suggests pause. They move on when scale suggests movement. This is not coincidence. Architecture here functions as pedagogy. It teaches norms through space rather than rules. It produces compliance without enforcement. Comfort follows alignment. Discomfort follows deviation. This method is more efficient than command. Command invites resistance. Environment produces habit. The estate's power lies in its ability to make hierarchy feel natural rather than imposed. 7. The limits of architectural power. Architectural authority, however, is not infinite. It depends on shared cultural assumptions that scale equals legitimacy, that stone equals continuity, that distance equals authority. As long as these assumptions hold, the architecture governs quietly. When they weaken, architecture continues to speak, but fewer people listen instinctively. Biltmore was designed for a world that still believed built form could stabilize social order. As informality gained cultural value and authority became negotiable, the cues embedded in the building lost part of their force. The rooms did not shrink. The ceilings did not lower. The hierarchy did not disappear. What disappeared was consensus. Architecture can organize space indefinitely. It cannot organize belief forever. 8. From operational power to historical power. Today, Biltmore's architecture still overwhelms physically, it still calibrates movement, it still suggests authority, but that authority has shifted categories. It is no longer operational. It is historical. The house no longer governs behavior. It demonstrates how behavior was once governed. Visitors comply temporarily not because they accept hierarchy but because they are observing it. This shift is crucial. Biltmore's architecture has not failed. It has been recontextualized. Its power has moved from enforcement to explanation, from command to illustration. The building remains intact because its meaning has changed. 9. Architecture as evidence. Biltmore now functions as evidence rather than instrument. Evidence of a moment when private individuals believed architecture could solve systemic uncertainty. Evidence of a belief that permanence could be built rather than negotiated. Evidence of how far scale could be pushed before it required institutional support. The estate stands as a record of ambition translated into space. It also stands as a reminder of architecture's limits. Stone can slow time, it cannot stop it. Labor and cost, the invisible price. Biltmore Estate was never sustained by architecture alone. It was sustained by labor, organized, disciplined, and largely erased from view. From the moment the project moved from drawing to ground labor became the estate's most important material. Stone, steel, wood, and glass mattered, but only insofar as they could be coordinated by human effort. Scale transformed that effort into a system. What appears serene in finished form is the residue of constant motion. This is where the illusion of permanence begins to demand payment. 1. Construction as industrial event. Biltmore's construction did not resemble traditional domestic building. It resembled an industrial operation temporarily relocated to a rural landscape. Hundreds, then thousands of workers were involved across phases: quarrymen, stonecutters, carpenters, metalworkers, electricians, plasterers, painters, and transport crews. Materials arrived by rail and wagon in continuous streams. Schedules were dictated not by comfort or season but by coordination. Delays were expensive. Completion was non-negotiable. The worksite was hierarchical by necessity. Tasks were segmented. Skills were specialized. Supervision was layered. The project demanded predictability, not improvisation. Individual labor mattered less than throughput. If one worker failed, another replaced him. The estate absorbed effort without recording identity. This anonymity was not accidental. It was functional. A project of this scale cannot carry personal narratives. It requires interchangeable roles. The finished building preserves the results of labor while erasing its traces. What remains visible is mastery without makers. 2. Engineering invisibility. Invisibility was designed alongside grandeur. Service corridors, secondary staircases, and hidden routes were not afterthoughts. They were integral. The house anticipated the presence of labor and engineered its absence from experience. Workers needed to circulate continuously, cleaning, heating, maintaining, preparing, without intersecting the spaces meant to project authority. This separation did not only protect aesthetic calm, it protected hierarchy. Power that acknowledges labor risks negotiation. Power that appears self-sustaining does not. By removing labor from view, the house presented itself as stable rather than serviced. The illusion of effortless permanence depended on this erasure. The result was a parallel architecture, one visible, one concealed. Both were essential. Only one was meant to be seen. Drisement. Maintenance as permanent condition. Completion did not end cost. It redefined it. A building of this size does not settle into equilibrium. It enters a state of continuous requirement. Heating systems demanded fuel and oversight. Electrical systems required monitoring and repair. Roofs weathered. Stone aged unevenly. Interiors dulled. Landscapes reverted if left unattended. Maintenance was not episodic. It was structural. The estate did not operate on cycles of use and rest. It operated on cycles of activation and idling. Even when rooms were empty, systems continued. Staff remained. The house consumed resources, whether or not it was occupied. This is the paradox of monumental scale. The larger the structure, the less it can afford to stop. What looks permanent from a distance is fragile in operation. 4. Labor as continuity. Labor provided continuity where ownership could not. Domestic service at Biltmore was not casual. It required training, scheduling, and discipline. Roles were defined, movement was regulated, presence was conditional. Workers entered rooms at prescribed times and disappeared when not required. Their success was measured by invisibility. This system produced smoothness. It also produced dependency. The house could not function without constant human input. Authority was maintained through repetition. Floors polished repeatedly. Fires tended daily. Grounds shaped season after season. The estate's calm surface was the result of unbroken effort. When labor conditions shifted nationally, when service became less abundant, more expensive, and less socially acceptable, the estate's dependency became visible. The system had been designed under assumptions that no longer held. This is where cost begins to surface. 5. Money as flow, not reserve. Biltmore did not preserve wealth. It redirected it. Industrial capital that might have remained liquid was converted into fixed form. But fixed form still requires liquidity to remain convincing. Maintenance transformed capital from reserve into flow. Money moved outward continuously into wages, repairs, fuel, upgrades, and replacements. There was no moment of payoff. Unlike factories, the estate did not generate profit. Unlike land speculation, it did not appreciate through exchange. Its value was symbolic and experiential. That value demanded ongoing expenditure without return in kind. This asymmetry defined the estate's vulnerability. As long as industrial wealth flowed steadily, the imbalance could be absorbed. When economic conditions tightened, the costs did not recede proportionally. Stone does not scale down. Systems do not simplify themselves. The estate required commitment even when justification weakened. 6. The second fire. Biltmore did not burn, but it experienced a slower combustion. Capital was consumed not by disaster, but by continuity. The daily cost of sustaining appearance accumulated quietly. Each decision to maintain rather than reduce extended the obligation. Each repair postponed decline while increasing dependence on future resources. This process resembles fire in one crucial respect: it converts material into heat without spectacle. The estate's grandeur masked this conversion. Visitors saw stability. Ledgers recorded consumption. The house did not announce its appetite, it demonstrated it. 7. Redistribution as survival. When private resources could no longer justify private scale, the solution was not abandonment. It was redistribution. Public access altered the economics of invisibility. Labor did not disappear, it changed form. Workers became guides, conservators, administrators, and managers. Maintenance became preservation. Service became interpretation. Costs were spread across visitors, tourism, infrastructure, and institutional frameworks that did not exist when the house was conceived. This redistribution preserved the structure by altering its meaning. What had once been hidden labor became visible stewardship. What had once been private expense became shared responsibility. The house survived by surrendering exclusivity. 8. The price of continuity. The estate stands today because its costs are no longer borne by a single family. They are distributed across systems willing to absorb them. This arrangement is stable, but it is not natural. It requires planning, governance, and constant justification. Permanence in this form is not an achievement, it is a contract. Biltmore remains intact not because it defeated cost, but because it learned how to live inside it. The illusion of timelessness is maintained through modern discipline, budgets, schedules, conservation science, and institutional labor. The price has never disappeared. It has only changed hands. 9. Labor as the true foundation. If stone gives the house weight, labor gives it time. The estate's history reveals a simple truth often obscured by architecture: permanence is not built once. It is rebuilt daily. Floors polished again. Systems tuned again. Landscapes corrected again. Without this repetition, the illusion collapses quietly. Labor is the estate's true foundation. It always has been. What changed is whether that foundation remained invisible. 10. Cost as revelation. Biltmore's survival clarifies the limits of private ambition. No matter how vast the initial investment, a structure of this scale eventually exceeds personal justification. It demands collective support or it declines. This does not diminish the building. It explains it. The estate stands as evidence that largest and most enduring are not equivalent categories. Scale amplifies cost. Cost demands systems. Systems reshape meaning. The invisible price was never optional. It was deferred. And when it came due, permanence had to renegotiate its terms. Vi. Life inside the building as a machine. Biltmore Estate was never organized around spontaneity. It was organized around predictability. What appears from a distance to be domestic life unfolding inside a large house was, in practice, a calibrated system of movement, timing, and separation. The estate did not merely host life, it processed it. This distinction matters. Homes absorb routines. Machines produce them. 1. Activation and dormancy. Life at Biltmore operated on a binary logic: activation and dormancy. When the house was on, it functioned at full institutional capacity. Staff numbers increased. Kitchens ran continuously. Public rooms were prepared, cleaned, reset, and cleaned again. Schedules tightened. Movement accelerated behind the walls while remaining invisible in front of them. When the house was off, it did not rest. Dormancy did not mean absence. It meant maintenance. Systems idled at reduced capacity. Rooms closed. Furnishings were covered or conserved. Landscapes continued to be shaped. The machine slowed, but it did not stop. This distinction reveals the estate's true nature. Domestic houses are built around use. Biltmore was built around readiness. Readiness requires constant rehearsal. Even when no one is watching, the system must remain intact. A machine that stops becomes unreliable. The estate could not afford unreliability. 2. Movement as control. Movement inside Biltmore was not free. It was routed. Guests entered through ceremonial thresholds designed to produce awareness. Doorways widened or narrowed to adjust pace. Staircases rose gradually, encouraging posture to change. Corridors lengthened perception of distance. The architecture guided bodies without instruction. This guidance was subtle but persistent. Visitors rarely noticed that their movement had been anticipated. They felt comfort rather than constraint. They moved where movement felt natural, paused where pause felt appropriate, and departed when the space suggested completion. The building did not tell them what to do. It made alternatives feel unnecessary. Staff followed an entirely different geography. Service corridors ran parallel to public spaces. Narrow staircases connected floors invisibly. Doors were aligned to minimize encounter. Routes doubled back, allowing labor to circulate continuously without appearing. This was not symbolism. It was logistics. The house functioned because two populations could occupy it simultaneously without colliding. One population was meant to be seen. The other was meant to be felt only through results. 3. Time as regulation. Time inside Biltmore was structured. Meals occurred on schedule. Rooms were prepared in advance. Fires were lit before arrival. Beds were turned down according to expectation rather than need. Nothing waited to be requested. Anticipation replaced response. This temporal discipline reduced uncertainty. When actions occur at predictable intervals, authority feels stable. The absence of delay creates the impression that the system is self-sustaining. Waiting introduces doubt. Smoothness reinforces control. The estate invested heavily in smoothness. Behind the scenes, time was fragmented. Tasks were segmented into shifts. Labor was distributed across hours to maintain continuity. Rest occurred when visibility was unnecessary. Night altered rhythm, not responsibility. The machine ran 24 hours a day, even when the house appeared still. 4. Meals as systemic performance. Dining at Biltmore was not primarily about nourishment. It was about order. Meals were events governed by protocol. Seating followed hierarchy. Timing was precise. Courses arrived in sequence. Transitions were smooth. Guests experienced flow without witnessing effort. In the kitchens, the experience was entirely different. Heat, noise, urgency, and coordination dominated. Multiple preparations occurred simultaneously. Timing errors had cascading effects. The margin for improvisation was minimal. The success of the dining room depended on the invisibility of this pressure. The house absorbed disorder and returned order. This transformation is mechanical. It requires repetition, discipline, and redundancy. Backup systems existed for failure. Extra staff absorbed error. The estate did not rely on excellence alone. It relied on buffers. Buffers are expensive. 5. Sleep and hierarchy. Sleeping arrangements reinforce spatial hierarchy. Guest rooms varied in size, light, and proximity. Position within the house communicated status without explanation. Access to views, silence, and distance from service routes was unevenly distributed. Servants' quarters were designed for response, not rest. Rooms were functional. Proximity mattered more than comfort. The architecture prioritized availability. Sleep occurred when it did not interfere with readiness. The building did not optimize for personal recovery. It optimized for continuity of service. Night did not dissolve hierarchy. It reconfigured it. 6. Leisure as managed activity. Leisure inside Biltmore was not spontaneous. It was allocated. Libraries, music rooms, and salons existed for specific forms of behavior. Acoustics guided conversation. Proportions determined duration. Even withdrawal had designated spaces. Privacy was structured rather than assumed. The architecture anticipated preference and narrowed choice. This narrowing reduced friction. When options are limited, coordination improves. Guests did not need to negotiate use of space. The house had already decided. Comfort followed alignment. 7. Education by environment. Children raised within the estate learned its logic early. They absorbed which rooms invited presence and which required restraint. They learned where voices softened, where movement slowed, where formality increased. No instruction was necessary. The environment taught expectation through repetition. Visitors learned faster. No rules were posted, none were needed. The scale of the building discouraged deviation. The consistency of order normalized compliance. Authority felt ambient rather than imposed. This is the efficiency of environmental control. 8. Rigidity as strength and weakness. The machine functioned well because it was rigid. Predictability reduced error. Repetition stabilized outcomes. Systems reinforced each other. The estate could absorb large numbers of people without visible disruption because it was designed for that purpose. But rigidity carries risk. Systems optimized for one mode of life resist adaptation. When patterns of use changed, when stays shortened, when informality increased, when hosting declined, the machine continued to demand the same coordination. The output diminished. The input did not. This imbalance exposed the cost of inflexibility. 9. Repurposing the machine. Public access introduced a new operating mode. Movement became guided rather than assumed. Labor became interpretive rather than invisible. The machine's outputs changed. Instead of producing private authority, it produced explanation, education, and spectacle. The architecture still organized behavior, but now it did so explicitly. What had once been implicit instruction became curated experience. The machine did not disappear. It was reprogrammed. 10. The machine today. Today, Biltmore still functions as a machine. Staff coordinate movement, maintenance, conservation, and interpretation. Systems run continuously, schedules govern use. The building remains disciplined. What has changed is the product. The machine no longer produces exclusivity. It produces historical clarity. Visitors do not participate in hierarchy. They observe it. The estate's life continues not as private routine, but as managed demonstration. The machine remains intact. Its purpose has shifted. VII. Fractures when conditions change. Biltmore Estate did not enter crisis through catastrophe. It entered it through misalignment. No fire announced the shift. No collapse forced a reckoning. The stone remained intact. The systems continued to run and the routines persisted. What changed was the environment that once made those routines sensible. The estate did not break. The context did. This is how large systems fail when they are built for permanence rather than adaptation. 1. Economic friction. The first fractures were economic, but they did not appear as loss. They appeared as drag. By the early 20th century, industrial wealth was no longer insulated from oversight. Regulation expanded unevenly, but persistently. Markets became more volatile. Financial transparency increased. The distance between private accumulation and public consequence narrowed. Money still existed. It moved differently. For estates like Biltmore, this shift mattered not because income vanished, but because justification weakened. The estate required continuous outflow wages, fuel maintenance replacement without producing corresponding economic return. As long as industrial wealth felt inexhaustible, this imbalance could be absorbed. As soon as wealth became managed rather than assumed, imbalance became visible. Costs did not rise suddenly. They accumulated. And accumulation, when unaccompanied by purpose, becomes friction. 2. Labor as negotiation. The labor environment that sustained Biltmore also changed. Domestic service, once abundant and socially normalized, became less so. Labor organization altered expectations. Wages increased. Mobility expanded. Service work lost its invisibility. Workers began to negotiate rather than comply. This shift did not dismantle the estate. It altered its rhythm. Systems designed around unquestioned availability now required planning. Redundancy became expensive. Replacement was no longer immediate. The smoothness that once defined the house demanded greater effort to maintain. The machine continued to run, but it ran louder. Increased visibility of labor undermined one of the estate's foundational assumptions that authority could remain abstract. When labor becomes visible, hierarchy becomes explicit. When hierarchy becomes explicit, it becomes debatable. 3. Cultural reorientation. Perhaps the most destabilizing fractures were cultural. The values that once equated scale with legitimacy began to invert. Informality gained prestige. Privacy replaced display as a marker of confidence. Excess lost its aspirational clarity and began to attract scrutiny. Biltmore's architecture did not adapt to this inversion. It could not. The estate was designed to communicate certainty. Its cues, mass distance order relied on shared cultural agreement. As that agreement weakened, the cues remained, but their meaning shifted. What once looked inevitable began to look deliberate. What once felt natural began to feel staged. The house did not lose its power to impress. It lost its power to explain itself. 4. Interruption by history. World events accelerated these fractures. War redirected resources and attention toward collective priorities. National narratives emphasized sacrifice, efficiency, and shared purpose. Monumental private leisure did not provoke outrage by itself, but it no longer aligned with prevailing ideals. The estate became an anachronism without becoming obsolete. Its existence was tolerated but increasingly questioned, not publicly, not loudly, but persistently. Why maintain a private system at such scale when public systems were under strain? What did such maintenance represent? The house offered no answer. It was not designed to argue. It was designed to assume. 5. Generational distance. As time passed, another fracture emerged: inheritance without context. Descendants inherited the structure but not the conditions that had made it rational. The house remained demanding. The assumptions that once justified those demands faded. What had felt like inevitability to its creator felt like obligation to his successors. This is a common fate of monumental projects. They outlive the logic that produced them and become tests of loyalty rather than expressions of belief. Maintenance becomes duty rather than conviction. Decisions become defensive rather than aspirational. Biltmore entered this phase quietly. There was no dramatic renunciation. There was gradual reconsideration. The question was no longer how to live inside the estate, but whether it was reasonable to sustain it as it was. 6. Use declines, scale remains. Patterns of use changed before patterns of maintenance did. Hosting declined, stays shortened. The house activated less frequently. Informality reduced the need for ceremonial scale. But the estate's systems were not modular. They could not scale down easily. A building designed for full activation suffers when partially used. The machine demands input regardless of output. This mismatch exposed inefficiency in a new light. What had once been a signal of surplus became a liability. Inefficiency ceased to communicate control and began to communicate inertia. The estate still functioned. It no longer felt necessary. 7. Questioning without crisis. One of the most striking aspects of Biltmore's transition is the absence of crisis. There was no moment of collapse to justify dramatic intervention. Instead, the estate faced a more difficult challenge: gradual irrelevance. Without a clear breaking point, decisions required interpretation rather than reaction. This ambiguity delayed change. It also deepened it. Structures built to appear permanent struggle most when change is slow. They can withstand shocks. They are less equipped to respond to erosion. Biltmore's fractures accumulated invisibly until they demanded resolution. 8. From assertion to problem. At a certain point, the estate crossed a threshold. It stopped functioning as an answer and began functioning as a question. What does this house mean now? What does it justify? What system does it belong to? These questions did not require immediate answers, but once they existed, the estate's original logic was already compromised. Authority that must be explained has already changed form. The fractures did not damage stone or structure. They destabilized premise. 9. Fracture as revelation. In hindsight, the fractures reveal something the architecture concealed. Biltmore was never a permanent solution. It was a temporary alignment rendered durable. When the alignment dissolved, the durability remained, but without direction. The estate did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was built too well for a single moment. Permanence magnified mismatch. 10. The necessity of transformation. By the time the fractures became undeniable, the options were limited. Reduction would have damaged integrity. Abandonment would have accelerated decay. Denial would have increased cost. Only transformation remained. The estate could survive, but not as it had been imagined. It would need to change categories, move from private assertion to managed continuity. That transition did not erase the fractures. It responded to them. VEI, collapse or transformation. Biltmore Estate did not face a dramatic choice between survival and ruin. It faced a quieter decision whether to change meaning in order to keep form. Collapse would have been visible. Transformation would be procedural. The estate chose the latter. 1. The moment without drama. There was no single year when Biltmore fell. No public crisis forced an announcement. No catastrophe demanded emergency measures. What emerged instead was administrative clarity. Costs were known, use patterns were measured, labor requirements were mapped. The mismatch between private purpose and institutional scale could no longer be treated as temporary. The estate did not bleed suddenly. It drained continuously. In such conditions, inertia is expensive. Transformation began not with ideology but with accounting. 2. Reclassifying the house. The first decisive act was conceptual rather than physical. Biltmore stopped being treated as a home that happened to be large and began to be treated as a large system that happened to contain domestic spaces. This reclassification altered every subsequent decision. Rooms were no longer evaluated by comfort alone but by durability and interpretability. Movement was no longer assumed, it was planned. Staffing was no longer private service, it became professional operation. The estate did not abandon privacy, it redefined it. Ownership remained private, operation did not. This distinction allowed the house to enter a new category without surrendering identity. It was no longer a residence in the traditional sense, but it was not a museum either. It became something intermediary, a managed environment anchored in private origin and sustained by public participation. 3. Opening without surrender. Public access did not mean openness in the ordinary sense. The estate did not invite uncontrolled entry. It structured experience. Routes were defined, narratives were curated, spaces were protected through supervision rather than restriction. What visitors received was not freedom but access under terms. This matters. Transformation did not dissolve authority. It redistributed it. Control moved from owner to manager, from assumption to procedure. The estate replaced inherited command with institutional governance. Decisions were documented, standards were established. Preservation replaced discretion. This governance preserved the building precisely because it limited improvisation. 4. Labor reframed as stewardship. Perhaps the most significant transformation occurred in the role of labor. What had once been invisible service became visible stewardship. Workers were no longer expected to disappear behind walls. They were expected to maintain, explain, and protect. Roles shifted from domestic obedience to professional responsibility. This change altered the moral economy of the estate. Labor was no longer justified by hierarchy. It was justified by care. The house did not become easier to maintain. It became easier to justify maintaining. This reframing preserved continuity while altering meaning. The estate could now claim legitimacy not through exclusion but through responsibility. 5. Preservation as discipline. Preservation introduced a new logic. Instead of maintaining the appearance of timelessness, the estate began maintaining evidence of time. Wear was documented. Materials were conserved rather than replaced indiscriminately. Interventions were recorded rather than hidden. The illusion of stasis gave way to managed aging. This shift required expertise, not tradition. Conservation science replaced inherited knowledge. Budgets replaced intuition. Schedules replaced seasons. Permanence became a function of planning rather than belief. 6. Economics of access. Public access restructured the estate's finances. Revenue streams diversified. Tickets, tourism, partnerships, events, and ancillary activities distributed cost across a broader base. The house no longer depended solely on private wealth to absorb its demands. This redistribution stabilized operation. It also introduced accountability. An estate sustained by visitors must remain legible. Its narrative must be coherent. Its purpose must be explainable. Transformation required the house to articulate itself for the first time. This articulation did not weaken it. It clarified it. 7. Authority without command. One of the subtler outcomes of transformation was the shift in how authority operated. The house no longer commanded behavior through assumption. It guided behavior through design and explanation. Visitors complied not because hierarchy demanded it, but because the environment and narrative encouraged it. Authority became consensual. This form of authority is less absolute but more durable. It relies on participation rather than obedience. The estate traded immediacy of control for longevity of relevance. This trade was essential. 8. What was lost? Transformation preserved structure, but it did not preserve experience. The life the house was built to contain ended. Private rhythms dissolved. Institutional schedules replaced personal ones. Intimacy gave way to circulation. Silence gave way to interpretation. These losses were not incidental. They were the price of survival. The estate could not remain both private and permanent at institutional scale. One had to give way. 9. What was saved? What survived was form, integrity, and legibility. The building remained intact. The landscape remained disciplined. The architecture continued to communicate scale and order. The estate avoided ruin precisely because it accepted reinterpretation. Transformation saved the structure by ending its original function. This is not failure, it is adaptation under constraint. 23. Transformation as limit. Biltmore's transformation marks the limit of private architectural ambition. Beyond a certain scale, permanence cannot remain personal. It must become collective, managed, and justified. The estate demonstrates where that threshold lies. It did not collapse. It crossed categories. The house remains because it stopped insisting on the world that produced it. What remains? Biltmore Estate exists today in a condition that appears resolved. The stone holds. The rooms remain ordered. The grounds are maintained with precision. What remains visible is scale. What has vanished is necessity. This distinction defines the estate's present. 1. Form without imperative. Biltmore no longer functions as a solution to a living problem. It functions as a preserved answer to a question that is no longer being asked. The architecture still communicates authority through mass proportion and sequence, but that authority no longer directs behavior beyond the boundaries of the visit. The house does not organize social life. It organizes interpretation. Visitors are not received, they are routed. They do not participate in hierarchy, they observe it. The shift is subtle but decisive. What was once operational power has become representational power. The building's form still instructs the body, slowing movement, shaping attention, but it no longer claims jurisdiction over belief. Authority has become demonstrative rather than directive. 2. Continuity through management. The estate's stability today is not the product of tradition. It is the product of administration. Budgets are planned. Conservation protocols are enforced. Materials are tested, repaired, documented. Landscapes are maintained according to schedules informed by science rather than intuition. Every visible calm is supported by invisible process. This is not decline. It is a different mode of endurance. Where permanence once relied on ownership and assumption, it now relies on governance. The estate survives because it has accepted limits on access, on use, on improvisation. These limits protect integrity at the cost of spontaneity. Continuity has replaced confidence. 2. Labor made legible. One of the most significant changes in what remains is the visibility of labor. Maintenance is no longer hidden. It is framed as stewardship. Guides, conservators, and technicians are part of the estate's narrative. Their presence does not interrupt the illusion. It explains it. This explanation changes the moral structure of the place. Where labor once existed to erase itself, it now exists to justify continuity. The estate's survival is presented not as inevitability but as effort. The cost of scale is acknowledged rather than denied. This acknowledgement does not weaken the building. It reframes it. 4. Scale as experience, not claim. Biltmore's scale still overwhelms, but it overwhelms differently. Visitors feel the size of rooms, the distance between spaces, the weight of materials. They register excess. But they do not interpret that excess as command. They interpret it as historical condition. Scale becomes experiential rather than prescriptive. The building no longer asks to be accepted as natural. It asks to be understood as constructed. The illusion of timelessness is maintained visually, but its logic is exposed contextually. The estate's meaning now depends on explanation. 5. Memory without nostalgia. What remains at Biltmore is not nostalgia. The estate does not ask visitors to mourn a lost world or admire its values. It presents evidence. The house is not a shrine to aristocracy. It is a record of an American attempt to simulate it. This distinction matters. Nostalgia invites longing. Evidence invites analysis. Biltmore survives because it offers the latter. It allows visitors to see how power once attempted to stabilize itself through form. It does not require agreement with that attempt. It only requires attention. The house no longer needs belief to endure. 6. The estate as interface. In its current state, Biltmore functions as an interface between eras. On one side is the Gilded Age logic of private permanence, architectural authority, and invisible labor. On the other is a contemporary system of access management and interpretation. The estate mediates between these systems without fully belonging to either. This mediation is its present role. The building translates its own past into a form that can be sustained by present institutions. In doing so, it reveals the conditions under which such translation is possible. Not everything can be preserved this way. Only structures willing to relinquish function can retain form. 7. What no longer exists. Several things do not remain. The assumption that scale equals legitimacy, the belief that stone can settle social uncertainty, the confidence that private wealth can sustain institutional form indefinitely. These assumptions were embedded in the estate's original logic. Their absence is what most clearly separates the present from the past. Biltmore stands without them. 8. What endures? What endures is not certainty but coherence. The estate's architecture still communicates a complete vision. Its systems still operate. Its landscape still frames experience. The building remains legible because it has accepted reinterpretation. Endurance here is conditional. It depends on relevance, not authority. On explanation, not assumption. On participation, not exclusion. This is a quieter form of permanence. 9. The limit of scale. Biltmore's present clarifies a broader lesson. Scale does not guarantee durability. It magnifies dependency. The larger the structure, the more systems it requires to sustain it. When those systems change, scale becomes liability before it becomes legacy. The estate survives because it crossed that threshold deliberately. It did not pretend to remain what it was. It accepted becoming what it needed to be. 10. A structure without command. Today, Biltmore stands without issuing orders. It does not demand reverence. It does not impose hierarchy. It does not claim inevitability. It offers space evidence and continuity under management. What remains is a structure that has outlived its original purpose without outliving its usefulness. 11. The present as proof. Biltmore's present condition is proof of something its builders could not have predicted. That permanence is not achieved by resisting change but by surviving it. That architecture can outlast ideology if it relinquishes control. That the most enduring structures are often those that stop insisting on their original meaning. The estate remains because it learned this early enough. X. Silent ending. Biltmore Estate still stands. The stone has not shifted. The towers remain upright. The distances between rooms are unchanged. What has changed is not the structure. What has changed is the reason it exists. Biltmore was built to make permanence visible. Its mass was meant to settle doubt. Its architecture was meant to answer a question that could not yet be asked directly, whether American wealth, new industrial and volatile, could ever look as though it belonged to history rather than the present. For a moment it did. The house performed stability. The land performed continuity. The systems behind the walls performed effortlessness. But permanence did not arrive as a condition. It arrived as a task. That task has never ended. Today, the estate survives because permanence has been redefined. It is no longer claimed. It is maintained. It no longer rests on ownership. It rests on coordination. It no longer depends on belief. It depends on work. This shift does not weaken the house. It explains it. The architecture still communicates authority through scale and order. Visitors still feel it physically in the length of corridors, the height of ceilings, the weight of materials. Bodies still respond even when minds remain detached. But authority no longer issues commands. It offers evidence. Biltmore now stands as a record of an American attempt to translate industrial power into aristocratic form. It shows how architecture was asked to do cultural work it was never fully equipped to do, to stabilize uncertainty, to slow time, to turn wealth into inheritance. The building succeeded just enough to endure. It failed just enough to adapt. That balance is what remains. The estate no longer claims to exist outside history. It exists inside. It documented, interpreted, conserved. Every repair acknowledges time. Every tour acknowledges distance between past intent and present meaning. The illusion of timelessness persists visually, but its mechanics are no longer hidden. The silence at the end of this story is not absence. It is resolution without closure. Biltmore does not conclude anything. It does not argue for a return to scale hierarchy or private permanence. It does not condemn them either. It stands, and in standing, it reveals the cost of asking architecture to carry certainty. Stone can slow erosion. It cannot stop it. What endures here is not inevitability, but negotiation. Between form and function, between memory and use, between the ambitions of one era and the constraints of the next. The largest private home in America still occupies its land. It no longer occupies the position it was built to claim. The structure remains. The systems that sustain it have changed. The world that made such a structure rational does not return. And that is enough. Nothing collapses. Nothing resolves completely. The house stands not as a promise but as proof.